Hello everyone, they're DIABLO FSW, Floor Shoot Wrestling. Coming here with some martial arts, grappling, wrestling knowledge. Hit like, subscribe, so I keep making these videos for you. And today's topic concerns the European origins of what we know as Jiu-jitsu. And when I say that, I can simplify it and you can do your own research. And this is something that I didn't come to this a long time ago. This is more recent over all my time spent and research I've done. But you could say that catch wrestling, catch as catch can wrestling, hooking and shooting, the foundation of professional wrestling. This is what I do. I do all forms of wrestling, let's say. I'm not primarily a grappler, but I study all forms of wrestling, and I've done pro wrestling. I'm primarily interested in the shoot style wrestling, but I do jiu-jitsu as well. And the idea that the techniques that form the basis of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, MMA, the idea that comes from Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, I think is wrong. If you want to look at some of the oldest forms of Japanese unarmed combat, what was considered Jiu-Jitsu back then, it was never a specific one discipline. Like, it was never specifically grappling in the samurai time. I would have to say, if you want to go the furthest back, it's like Aikijitsu, samurai Aikijitsu. And that doesn't look anything like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or no-gi or catch wrestling. No-gi Jiu-Jitsu and catch wrestling look identical. The only difference is the Gracie theory is different from catch wrestling theory in the sense, in a quick description, that the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu theory, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu theory, as I understand it, is 90% of the fight, 90% of street fights, real fights, end up on the ground. So take the fight to the ground first. So then, doesn't matter where you get on the ground. The idea is to take the fight to the ground. Then you establish the position, dominant position. It can be side control, it can be the bottom, guard, it could be mount. But you do not simply go into a submission and grab it and go for it. You first establish the dominant position and you take your time, then you apply the submission. So sure, it can be done quicker, but the notion is that you're establishing a dominant position first and then applying the submission. Whereas catch wrestling is different. Catch will snatch anything anywhere they get it and go right, like you see Sakuraba. You see how Sakuraba, if you study his fights, he'll give his back and do a standing kimura and stuff like that. So stuff like that, snatching from a collar and elbow, trying to snatch a submission right from there. It's a more violent approach to wrestling. Gentle jiu-jitsu is gentler. Hence the name jiu-jitsu. Not to say it's less effective by any means, because catch wrestling is not as developed, and a lot of catch wrestling was lost within the pro wrestling world, because there was a time when Carl Gotch, you go to Luthez and these guys, hookers, shooters, real wrestlers, going back to the oldest days, George Hackenschmidt and the Strangler Lewis and so forth, real hookers, real shooters, real wrestlers. When you come to today, now, even Harley Race, they said, was the last one who could really defend the belt. Nowadays, these guys are just performing matches, and whoever has the belt doesn't mean they're necessarily the best wrestler in a real wrestling situation. So with that being said, it's interesting because maybe the hooking and shooting was lost in the pro wrestling, but according to Hori and Gracie, and maximum respect to Gracie family, and I respect Hori immensely, he said something to the effect of that the art that the Brazilians are doing with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu as actually Japanese, but was so shrouded and so kept secret and hidden, and people not wanting to share it, that it was lost, and that's what they're. So I think he's saying that just to be nice to the Japanese, or maybe he really sincerely believes it. But the fact of the matter is that I don't see that that's the case, because men have been wrestling and doing no-gi type of stuff since day one. You can look at the Beni Hassan, ancient Egypt, going before the Greek, before the Roman, and before the Pancratian, before the gladiator fights, and you see the same submissions back in ancient Egypt. So the idea that the Japanese made it up is not accurate to begin with, because a lot of these you can see them in the Beni Hassan. And furthermore, you look at the oldest Japanese style. With respect, I love Japanese martial arts, but let's just be honest what we're talking about here. Who made all that stuff up? Whose art is that? What we know is no-gi jiu-jitsu. Is it Japanese, Brazilian, or European? I say it's European. I didn't always believe that. But you can look at Carl Gotch, his contemporary, his classmate, Billy Robinson, hookers and shooters, catch wrestling, catchers, catch can wrestling, Wigan wrestling, Lancashire wrestling, right? So their teacher is Billy Riley, Snake Pit. And that's like origins of catch wrestling in our era, and like two of the last hookers and shooters. You got Luthez in there, and you also got my teacher, Rusty Brook, his teacher, the great Malenko, Boris Malenko, another shooter from that era. So I'll put it to Billy Robinson. He says in a video I saw of his, something to the effect that my teacher, his teacher, Billy Riley, we're talking about a Kimura now, for those who know what it is. He says, my teacher, Billy Riley, taught that Kimura to Ricky Dozan, who taught it to Kimura. So Ricky Dozan is old school. He was killed with a knife with a urine on it. He's a gangster, apparently. Rest in peace, I guess, you know? So Ricky Dozan is an old school, like 1950s pro wrestler and OG pro wrestler, even, you know, before Antonio Inoki and all those guys. And so the notion is that's presented by Billy Robinson. Billy Riley, his teacher, Lancashire wrestling, catch can wrestling, hooking and shooting. He, in fact, taught the Kimura or double wrist lock, as it's called in catch wrestling and pro wrestling. Kimura is the name of a Japanese dude who broke Helio Gracie's shoulder using that hold, and the Brazilians thereafter called the hold Kimura because they didn't know it. But it's a basic professional wrestling hold, and it's a basic catch wrestling hold, simply called double wrist lock. So Billy Robinson says that. And this is like, you know, you talking about these people who think that's thousands of years old. In Europe, they've been doing folk wrestling. Everybody wrestled in Germany and all these places in medieval times and so forth. It's common, everybody wrestling in fields and everything. So they had jacket even wrestling. My guild, Meyer Freifechter Guild, 1570, 1560, Germany area, there's descriptions and other related groups, other manuals that we have, and they show jacket wrestling, you know, and there was regular wrestling and jacket wrestling. So they already had gi and no gi back then in Europe in Renaissance and medieval times. So it's definitely not a new invention. And you go further with it, Brazilian Jiu-jitsu is not exactly Japanese Jiu-jitsu, because it comes through the personage of Count Maeda, Count Koma. And Count Koma himself went from Japan, judo jiu-jitsu guy. He traveled all over Europe, fighting, doing like MMA, Vale Tudo type of fights, mixed fights against all sorts of people from all different backgrounds. Wrestlers, boxers, all kind of people. So he studied and learned to catch wrestling over there and observed it and had to fight those fighters. So by the time Maeda gets to Brazil and teaches Carlos Gracie and Helio Gracie, he's absorbed all the catch wrestling and everything from Europe. So you look at Brazilian Jiu-jitsu, no gi, and you look at catch wrestling. They look almost identical, even if they have a different approach. Whereas you look at like Aikijitsu and Japanese Jiu-jitsu, it's very different. Further, Japanese Jiu-jitsu black belt is a white belt in Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. You don't keep your belt. If you're supposedly a black belt in Japanese Jiu-jitsu, typically it's connected to karate. You don't keep your belt. Now Judo, a lot of those dudes will. But the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people don't basically have any respect for Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. I've seen only a couple instances where anybody had any ability from one to the other. Whereas the Judo people, a lot of those guys do Newaza and stuff, so a lot of those guys have more of a similar background. And the Judo people tend to keep their belts. So the idea that Europeans created what we know of Jiu-Jitsu as Jiu-Jitsu, you can look at it in the sense that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But I'm not saying they created Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, Samurai Jiu-Jitsu, because that's something very different. It's practiced also with armor. So you see stuff like this that they'll do, and some people will explain it like, yeah, you really can't do that to somebody in the street or in Jiu-Jitsu or in catch wrestling, a wrist manipulation. But if you have the armor here and stuff, it wedges on their shoulder. So I don't want to be the final authority on it. I'll just put it out there to you. I know it's kind of a radical thought, but after all my years of study, and I haven't came to this conclusion for a very long time, I never would have believed it. And it was always perplexing to me to think that Karl Gotch and great Malenko trained the Japanese shoot wrestlers and all that. And that never made sense to me. And my teacher taught me that. It never made sense to me. I'm like, how is these Europeans gonna teach those people jiu-jitsu stuff? But yeah, maybe they didn't. It makes sense that they really didn't have that. You know what I mean? No wonder the Japanese people all do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu now. They're not using Japanese Jiu-Jitsu in MMA. All those guys are doing BJJ. So it's a very interesting topic. And, hopefully I don't offend anybody with this. It's just a matter of trying to get to the truth and get to the source of things, and also give respect to catch wrestling. Catch can wrestling, hooking and shooting. My teacher's teacher, the great Malenko, Boris Malenko, Karl Gotch, Billy Robinson, Billy Riley. Apart from that, Josh Barnett is the greatest representative of catch wrestling, I would say, in the contemporary times. UFC champion. I'm a big fan of that guy. I always support him. Pro wrestler as well. So Also, you have to say Eric Paulson. You know, he's contributed as well. Another name that will go in there is Guy Chase, coming off the Bruce Lee and the Jeet Kune Do lineage and so forth. So I'm not claiming to be no catch wrestling expert. I'm familiar with hooking and shooting, but my background is very hybrid. I already had a lot of the jiu-jitsu and stuff like that, so it was more the approach and some other moves that I really wasn't aware of. A lot of catch wrestling stuff is kind of hokey, especially when you take it to the pro wrestling level, but it has more submissions. And then Japanese basically has less, and then Brazilian is even more distilled into all the realistic stuff that's high percentage that's actually going to work. So I'll let you do your own research. And I know it's a radical thought, but the idea that Europeans, or that there was a European tradition of what we now know as jiu-jitsu, you know, prior to the Japanese or before getting there, even if that has influence on it. I know it's a radical thought, and it's not something I always knew since I was a child. It's something that I've come to in the past several years. So food for thought. Do your own research, but at the very least, give catch wrestling, thus professional wrestling, catch as catch can wrestling, hooking and shooting, Lancashire wrestling, Wigan wrestling, European wrestling. Give it its credit, because it is one of the key wrestling systems that brought us to where we're at now, even if it's not giving enough respect. And I'd like to bring some of that respect to it, because there are different elements to a lot of stand-up wrestling, a lot of upper body wrestling, and that's a lot of stuff I use as well. So this won't be the last video I do on catch wrestling, but I'd like for you in the interim to please do some of your own research, and like and subscribe, please.